Hello and welcome. I'm Fahd Husain. Tonight, Islamabad waits. And I use that word deliberately. Islamabad waits. It waits for two delegations that may yet arrive. It waits as the ceasefire clock ticks down towards a deadline that now feels less like a date on a calendar and more like a warning. And it waits knowing that what happens in the next hours may decide whether this region moves back towards diplomacy or slides again towards war. The US says it expects talk to proceed. A US delegation is preparing to come. Iran has signaled hesitation, even mistrust. There is uncertainty. There are last-minute complications. There are reasons for skepticism, and yet the channel is still open. Pakistan helped broker the ceasefire. Pakistan hosted the first 21 hours of talks. Pakistan has been working the phones, moving diplomatically, preparing security, preparing logistics, preparing the ground, preparing, in other words, for peace. Security has been tightened, arrangements are in place. Islamabad is ready. The question tonight is whether the parties are ready. None of the major players truly want this war to restart. Not Washington, not Tehran, not the Gulf. This may be one of those rare days when a great deal is decided in a very short span of time. So where do we stand tonight? Are we on the edge of a second chance or the edge of renewed conflict? These are tonight's questions, and they deserve a serious conversation. Let's have it. To discuss this, we are joined by Uzair Yunus. He is a partner at the Asia Group in the US, also a well-known policy analyst, keeps a very close eye on the politics and economy, not only of Pakistan, but of the whole region. Uzair Yunus, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me, Fahd.
So now, obviously, this is a very important day. So much happening and yet not enough happening. We're not sure exactly where things are going. The ceasefire deadline is now inching closer by the hour. What is the sense of where you are? Is the whole scene very tense? Are people bracing for peace, or in fact the prospects of war starting again are dangerously near?
So I think at this point in time, Fahd, where we are is there definitely is a lot of confusion, even in Washington, D.C., about where things stand and what is the next step or what are the outcomes from the next round of talks between the United States and Iran. My own assessment at this point is that there's a lot of pomp and circumstance of diplomacy that is being played out in an always online world. And what do I mean by that? For example, when the first round of talks happened, you will recall and your audience will recall that the Iranians were in Islamabad first, and they had to wait for the Americans to arrive and then begin the conversation. I think this time around, what we will likely see is the Americans will come in first, and the Iranians will come in second to sort of have this balance, right, of who plays the waiting game and who gets to sort of enter the room at the end, which is the pomp and circumstance part. And in addition to that, you have the tweets, you have the statements, you have, people making off-record comments, etc., about what's going on. What I think is likely to happen, and the base case scenario, in my opinion, is that we are further ahead in terms of the framework than people think. I do not think that General Munir or Field Marshal Munir would have gone to Tehran for a number of days to talk to the IRGC and other Iranians, only to have the talks be derailed at the last minute. So I'm positively hopeful that whenever the talks resume in Islamabad, we will see an extension of a ceasefire as well as a broad momentum being built towards a framework agreement between the United States and Iran.
I would actually tend to agree with you because I think you're absolutely right. There was a lot of work done after the first round, and you mentioned the visit of Field Marshal Asim Munir to Tehran. I think that was a crucial moment, and the very fact that President Trump then announced that he is going to send his team to Islamabad, to me at least, that meant that Pakistan had communicated the discussion in Tehran, and there was clearly enough grounds for President Trump to say, okay, let's give it another shot.
I agree. And I think, again, part of that agreement and the framework that has been reached as well, right, is not only that the trip to Tehran was important, but what people forgot when the first round ended and there were a lot of reports about this being a failure, what people did not appreciate is that unlike the Americans, the Iranian delegation cannot be in real-time communication with their leadership, especially the supreme leader. They are following a mosaic doctrine of like decentralized communications, which is obviously the rational choice to make given the assassination campaigns. And so they had to go back and they had to engage internally, right? So my view is that we're halfway along or more than halfway along in this agreement. And the other important signal to me has been that the Lebanon-Israel conversation is also moving forward in parallel. So if the talks were not proceeding positively, then that channel most definitely would have collapsed by now. And then, of course, we would have been talking about an imminent collapse of the ceasefire in the Strait of Hormuz as well.
It seems very clearly that there's a public narrative which is going along, and then there's a private back channel conversation which may not be as hawkish as what we are hearing publicly. And I say that in the context of the various posts and tweets that President Trump has been doing in the last couple of days, which have been very aggressive, very inflammatory, very provocative, and they've had a reaction from the Iranian side also. There's this incident of the ship, Americans taking over an Iranian ship, etc., etc. So there's a lot of things happening which seem to suggest that if there's any deal in the offing, it doesn't seem very promising. But at the same time, clearly there is a back channel also going on. So the way that President Trump has been communicating, do you think that's all for public consumption, and behind all of this there is a very rational and calculated back channel going on?
Well, part of it is obviously his own personality and his own style of negotiation, right? If you recall, the first Trump administration used to refer to the North Korean leadership as Rocket Man, right? And like really inflammatory stuff that people were worried about. And then we ended up having a summit all of a sudden, right? So that's his approach, for good and for bad, in my opinion. And the madman theory that he keeps testing is something that he thinks works. I tend to disagree, but that's his style. But I think in terms of where both sides are right now and the signals they're giving publicly, I read that more of as posturing than anything else. And again, the blockade itself, for example, is basically a red herring in the negotiation of saying, I'm going to insert another ask on your side, meaning I being America, you being Iran, and then you're going to ask for me to concede on that point, but that point did not exist the last round, right? So now I've made a concession by creating something new, and now the talks can go on where you have to give me some concessions too. So I see this playing out in terms of posturing. The other part of the posturing game that both sides are playing is playing to their own domestic galleries, where there are hawks who say that you can get the job done in DC. There are many people who claim that continuous pressure on Tehran will lead to the decimation of the regime. I think that's a flawed approach, but Donald Trump has to play to those. And in the IRGC as well, there are many who think that America is near defeat. And if you don't take a deal right now and continue to ratchet up the pain, then the Arabs and the rest of the global economy will go in a meltdown, and then America will have to retreat from here with a big loss, right? I think they're both wrong, but both sides have to play to the hawks in either camp as well.
Which actually makes sense, because there are hawks on both sides, and they obviously they tend to opt for a conflict which continues to rage on till they win, but that's not going to happen. The bigger question for us here, then, and perhaps you can help us understand, is that when President Trump says that if the deal is not done, he will go back and he will destroy all power plants, etc., essentially saying that he's going to escalate and the war will get more intense and more destructive. But is that actually an option at all? Is there an appetite in the US for such an action, for renewed hostilities? Is there an appetite for something bigger, larger, ground offensive, something which can lead to a bigger catastrophe? And when I say appetite in the US, of course, when we look at the US media, it depends on what you're reading, and you get a sense of, okay, they're against this and people who are for this. But is it possible, or is it probable, that a majority of Americans are reading the situation correctly and they know that escalation and restarting the war is not really an option?
Well, so I think if you look at polling data coming out of over the last month or so coming out of America, there are a couple of things that are very clear. One, this is a war that is not popular, including within parts of the Republican Party. There has been a clear divide and a split within the MAGA base, even in terms of this war. And the anecdotal evidence I picked up on, in addition to the polling data, was you had the CPAC conference here a couple of weeks ago or so. And basically, people who attended that I spoke to said you couldn't find anybody under 30 who would call themselves a conservative, because this was a conservative conference, who was for this war. So the divide is real and the constraints are real within the party. That's one. The second one is that there's a real economic cost of this war that is being borne by consumers in a way that is hurting the president, because his whole campaign was on the idea of affordability and improving living standards for the people of America. So he's constrained by that, because if he escalates, then he knows the price of gasoline in particular will continue to go up, which bounds him in terms of a more rational path forward. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of if he chooses to escalate, then he's going towards a route that essentially means putting boots on the ground.
Yeah.
And there is basically no situation in which he can pull that off politically, given the divide in America about boots on the ground, with the midterms also coming up. So I think he's constrained by that. And he knows that, whatever has to happen now has to happen at the negotiation table. He can continue to squeeze Iran through a blockade and inflict real pain on the Iranian economy. But at the end of the day, a dramatic escalation is one that he's unlikely to pursue, in my opinion, at this point in time.
And of course, much of it is linked to, as you said, the unpopularity of the war and the fact that it is hurting him politically, and midterm elections are coming. Now, that is a factor, but is this also a factor that this is President Trump's last term? He is not going to be up for election. Yes, of course, his party, Republican Party, may suffer at the midterm polls, but perhaps for a president who's on his way out in 2 years or so, 2.5 years or so, that may not be as big a factor as perhaps is believed, that if he escalates, he can get a big win. You think that could be something that could be fueling him?
I think that's a fair point, but I think the other side actually would fuel him more, which is he's always wanted to have this big, beautiful deal with the Chinese, with the Iranians, with the North Koreans, right, to cement his legacy. So if you were to sort of say, what would I bet on Polymarket on? I would bet on the fact that Donald Trump deal moves forward, will actually to sign the deal himself. Because that's the part of his legacy that he wants to secure, and sort of show that he got a better deal, and a much better deal than the JCPOA that the Obama administration had, right? So I think when you think about Donald Trump and how he thinks about or talks about his own legacy, I would rather say that he would want to make a big deal first with the Iranians, then coming up with the Chinese, so that he's seen as this president who unlock certain things of value that are much more sustainable than another long drawn out war in Iran.
I have two more questions for you quickly. One, of course, as a Pakistani, what has happened in the last couple of weeks, our role, where things are, all as I've been saying, all roads are leading to Islamabad. Everything is happening here. We seem to be the center of world's attention. How is that impacted people that Pakistanis? Is there a visible shift in the way that Pakistan's perception has changed in the US and in the Washington Beltway, if I were to be a bit more specific?
So look, part of the Beltway remains deeply skeptical of Pakistan, and there's a long history in terms of why that skepticism persists, right? So that's obviously there. What has been, where there has been a shift has been in terms of the recognition that Pakistan still possesses significant diplomatic and kinetic heft, which not only has allowed it to play a mediating role, but also that kinetic heft and the strategic defense agreement with Saudi Arabia has acted as a deterrent. So when you talk to people who sort of look at what comes after this conflict in the region, they recognize that Pakistan basically has anchored itself as a net security provider in the GCC and the Persian Arabian Gulf region, right? And I think that's a big win for Pakistan because it anchors its own governance and security into the Middle East in ways that perhaps 2 years ago we would have never thought of, right? So I think there has been a shift. The other shift that's happened, Fahd, and again, you followed this over the years, is about the role of the diaspora, which has been deeply divided over the last couple of years. And so you are seeing this shift happening as well in the diaspora, where people are sort of saying, hang on a minute, perhaps there is a different way in which Pakistan can position itself in the world and play a positive role. And they're recognizing that this current government in Pakistan is playing that role in a much more responsible way and actually unlocking things of value for Pakistan and Pakistanis that have far-reaching consequences for the diaspora itself.
That's such an important point. Absolutely. And finally, you're very positive. You're sounding optimistic. That's wonderful to hear. So are we. We're all hoping that things actually work out. And if they do work out, then should we be ready to receive President Donald J. Trump in Islamabad?
I would not rule that out, right? I think it's maybe after this round is being too optimistic. But I think if there is an agreement made and a deal at hand that unlocks something major in the region in terms of the US and Iran and their relationship moving forward, I would bet good money on the fact that if that deal is happening, then Donald Trump will be in Islamabad.
Uzair Yunus, so wonderful to have you and to hear your analysis. Thank you so much, and I hope that you will be joining us again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back after the break. Now I want to talk a little bit about jet fuel. And the reason why that is such an important topic now is because it directly affects everybody who has any plans to travel. The crisis which is emanating out of the Straits of Hormuz is now rippling across the entire world and affecting the airline industry. But before I start talking about jet fuel, I want to just quickly tell you the difference between jet fuel and car fuel, just so that it helps us understand this situation better. Jet fuel is normally heavier. Car fuel is lighter, jet fuel has low freezing point, stable. Car fuel, of course, is higher freezing point, volatile, and more importantly, highly flammable. Jet fuel is less flammable. Anyways, now let's get to the real part. Jet fuel prices have gone up from $90 a barrel to $200 a barrel. That's the huge jump that has happened, and it is reflecting in the costing of the airline industry. Now, if you look at this graph, this explains airline operating expenses. And of the total expenses, 35% is fuel, jet fuel. And therefore, of course, higher the cost plus fewer flights means more expensive tickets. And that is why airlines are now raising fares, adding surcharges, and cutting flights. This is a crisis that is happening in real time. This essentially explains to you which countries are the key exporters of jet fuel. Of course, if you see the blue line, South Korea exports 250,000 barrels a day, by far the number one, and then USA, Netherlands, Singapore, India, Venezuela, and then at the end, of course, the Gulf countries. It is important to understand that, for example, South Korea, the raw material for jet fuel is crude oil, which comes primarily from the Gulf countries. Then the refineries, special refineries, converted into jet fuel, and those refineries then produce all the jet fuel that South Korea, for example, exports. Now, as a result of all of the shortages, here is a key figure that you need to understand. 75% of Europe's jet fuel is imported from the Gulf, and around 375,000 barrels per day. And in April, the import from the US was this much. Essentially, the bottom line that needs to be emphasized is that Europe, this is BBC reporting, Europe has maybe 6 weeks of jet fuel left. The energy boss has warned. This is the real crisis which is developing very quickly, primarily because of shortages and price hikes. This chart shows to you jet fuel price development. If you start from April 24, you see it's a pretty much stable, all of this. And then suddenly this graph around here, March 2026, it just goes skyways. So essentially this chart shows you the stability and then the sudden spike because of this conflict. This is a very serious issue, as a result of which, and here's where you and I come in. Anybody who wants to travel, well, there's the bad news. Ticket prices are going up, and going up by big margins. If you look at this one, for example, Islamabad to Dubai, these are average across all or airlines. In January 2026, if you wanted to travel from Islamabad to Dubai, the ticket was 85,000 rupees on an average. In April, it is now 245,000 Pakistani rupees. So that's almost a 300% jump. This is huge. Again, from Islamabad to London, January was rupees 260,000, and in April it is now 360,000 and probably rising. And finally, if you want to go to New York, in January 350,000, and in April now it is 700,000 rupees. So that's the jump that has come. Again, we don't know where the situation will go because the crisis continues to unfold, and as you will hear shortly, even if the conflict ends immediately, the difference, the impact on fuel charges and ultimately on airline prices is not going to happen very soon. So buckle up. So let's now turn to another dimension of this crisis, one that may not look as dramatic as warships in the Strait or negotiations in Islamabad, but could have consequences just as far-reaching and in some other ways even harder for the world to absorb. Because while diplomacy is trying to prevent military escalation, the markets are already trying to price what escalation could mean. And that is where this story becomes much bigger than oil. What traders, governments and consumers are all watching tonight is not whether simply crude goes up a few dollars, but whether a conflict that began as a regional military confrontation is beginning to threaten the stability of the global energy system itself. The Strait of Hormuz remains under pressure. The US blockade has injected new uncertainty into shipping calculations. Iran continues to signal it has options if pressure intensifies. And layered on top of that are growing concerns about what happens if stress spreads towards Bab al-Mandab, creating risks at two critical maritime choke points at the same time. Nearly a fifth of globally traded oil passes through the Hormuz. A serious disruption there would not remain confined to this region. It would move through prices, freight, insurance, inflation, supply chains, and eventually into politics and households far beyond the Gulf. That is why the market is reacting not just to events, but to possibilities. The real question tonight is whether markets are correctly pricing risk or whether they may still be underestimating how serious the downside could become if diplomacy fails. What is the realistic best case scenario for oil from here? And what is probably the worst case? How vulnerable are global supplies if this crisis deepens? And at what point does volatility turn into genuine economic shock? Those are the questions we need to understand tonight. And there are very few people better placed to help us do exactly that. And joining me to discuss this is a very special guest, Mr. Humayun Falak. He is the head of crude oil analytics at Kepler and is also a leading voice on global oil markets with deep expertise in crude flows, global market dynamics, and supply disruptions across the Middle East. He closely tracks real-time energy movements and provides critical analysis and insights into how geopolitical tensions from the Strait of Hormuz to broader regional conflicts translate into price volatility. So as you can see, he is the right man to actually speak on this topic. Mr. Falak, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Fahd. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I want to start with a question which I hope actually never comes true. If this conflict doesn't lead to a settlement in the near future, and the ceasefire gets broken, and the war restarts, what is the worst case scenario we are looking at in terms of what happens to oil supply, oil flows, oil pricing, and effects on the global economy?
I think the worst case scenario is we're not there yet, but what we're in already is close to this, and it's really the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Because as you know, before the war, you used to have roughly 16 million barrels per day of crude oil and condensate that used to pass through the strait to global markets. And since the beginning of the war, it's been extremely limited. So Iran was able to export its crude up until the US blockade got implemented last week. But even that oil from Iran now is not passing through, and going to world markets. And on the other hand, you have all the other countries in the region are only shipping very low level of crude. So we're talking about 200,000 barrels per day compared again with a level of 16 million barrels per day before. So I think the worst case scenario is if the war resumes, we could have the Iranians target production facilities in the region, which is something that so far they have not done that much. So except the Ras Laffan liquefaction facilities in Qatar, most of the other production facilities in the region have been more or less not so damaged, I would say. But if Iran damages production facilities or export terminals such as Yanbu on the Red Sea from Saudi Arabia or Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman from the Emirates, then we could see obviously even less crude reach global markets, and that means another rise in prices, in oil prices.
So we've seen a lot of fluctuation. Of course, we started from, I think, when the price, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was somewhere around $70 before the conflict. Then it went up to as high as probably $130, $140, maybe even $150. And then it's been fluctuating very rapidly, directly linked to the sentiment or the perception of where this conflict is going. And I'm sure a lot of people have made a lot of money also, most likely. But if things get worse, do you think the price could go far beyond that it has gone to, and how high could it go, and what kind of a huge impact would it have on countries which are very dependent on oil from the Gulf?
If you look at the price action in the past 2-3 weeks, really since the ceasefire was announced, it's been actually the market has been very complacent. I mean, you have Brent under $100 per barrel. You have equity markets at an all-time high in the US, for example, and close to their records in Europe. And so everything indicates that at least the market believes there is going to be a solution out there, and that the war is going to effectively stop. Maybe we'll see a deal, but that in effect we'll see a resumption of oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is already priced in. So this means that if there is no deal and the situation escalates from here militarily, then we should see a strong rebound in prices indeed, and we should see equity markets probably crash from there onwards. And I think back to how high it could go. You're right in saying that prices are already pretty high. You have Brent under $100 per barrel, but the cost of physical barrels, in terms of imports, is already much above that. So, for instance, if you look at Pakistan, it's probably importing oil at a cost of around $120, $125 per barrel right now, but it used to be $160 at the beginning of the war, or let's say a month ago. So I think we could at least go to those highs if there is no deal. And potentially, if there is further escalation and the market believes this will last another few weeks, then we could reach to new highs, and so we could go above where we were a few weeks ago.
Mr. Falakshai, I think we've looked at the worst case scenario, and that's very depressing. So now let's see if we can be a little bit more optimistic. And here in Islamabad in Pakistan, we have to be very optimistic because we are hoping that peace will break out from right here. So if we are optimistic and things work out, obviously that would reflect in confidence in the market, in the prices. Oil will come down. And we've seen that oil has actually come down very quickly also. So if there's actually some sort of a formal agreement, that would mean the price would come down. But how soon would that actually translate into the kind of normalcy that we had before the conflict? Because the general perception is that, if the market price goes down, it's going to take quite a while before people, at petrol stations will be paying the same kind of price that they were before the conflict. So what's that time lag generally?
I think it's probably we're talking about a few months. Even if there is, let's be very optimistic, as you said. Let's assume there is a deal, a formal deal, and full deal, which means that war stops and Iran opens the Strait of Hormuz. Even in this scenario, we think that it will probably take about at least 2 to 3 months before transit and passage through the strait normalizes. And that's mainly because it is a confidence issue for the maritime industry and the ship owners charge in order to take the risk of going through the strait. So we will see a huge jump, obviously, of passage. And we've actually started seeing this on Friday when the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Abbas Araghchi from Iran, announced that the strait was open. We saw a flurry of tankers going for the exit from the Persian Gulf and to try to exit the Strait of Hormuz. But then, obviously, as there were conflicting rumors, conflicting news from Iran, and we had shots towards some tankers, then most of them actually backtracked and came back into the Persian Gulf. So I'm saying that we see a big jump, but for this confidence to rebuild, it will take probably, we think, at least 2 to 3 months. But then looking at prices, I would say that we probably will not go back to where we were before the war, even though we will see prices decrease. And, right now we're at $95 per barrel Brent. We used to be at, you said, around $70 per barrel before the war started. I think the new normal probably will be around $80, $85 per barrel. And that's mainly because a lot of the countries which have drawn their inventories, they will be looking at rebuilding those stocks. And that means stronger demand on a more sustainable basis to rebuild the stocks as well.
But that also feeds into this assessment, Mr. Falakshai. Maybe you can add to that. A lot of people are saying that it's almost impossible to actually go back to where we were because so much has changed. The economies of the Gulf have taken a hit. It will take a very long time for them to recover, not just materially, but in terms of their perception. The Straits of Hormuz has been weaponized. We now know that it can be used as a weapon. And the whole dynamics of the region and possibly also the oil market, they've all changed. Can they just go back to the way they were, or should we be ready for this new kind of a world once this conflict ends?
I think you're totally right. I think there will be a risk premium incorporated into prices of oil coming from the Gulf, from the Persian Gulf. There will be a risk premium for tankers wanting to go in the Gulf and load crude and come back to go to global markets. So that risk premium is going to decrease if there is a deal, but is not going to disappear. So that is certain. And I think you are right in the sense that the perception in the region in terms of geopolitics will also has probably changed forever. And that's mainly because the Iran's neighbors now understand that in the long term, they cannot, plan accordingly as long as the Islamic Republic is around, because they know that whenever the Islamic Republic will be unhappy about something, there is the risk that they close the strait or that they bomb some of their facilities. So I think in the long term that this is probably one of the mistakes that Tehran has made, in the sense that it has proven to the world that it can close the strait. It can take the world hostage, if you may. But at the same time, it has proven to its neighbors that it can't be counted on the long term. And as you know, a lot of these countries, and especially in the GCC, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they have these long-term investment plans, which are obviously dependent on security in the region. So if there is no security on the long term, it is difficult for them to achieve these goals. And I think the geopolitics landscape in the region will have changed probably forever.
And finally, you're talking about geopolitics and how it's going to affect the oil industry and oil pricing and oil, the flow of oil. And also, of course, the search for alternates. I know I was speaking to some experts in the last couple of days also, and they all tend to agree that yes, there are alternatives, but actually there is no real alternative for the Strait or for the Persian Gulf and the oil that comes from there. So the world will remain on the volume of oil that is coming from there. My question is, will the world also remain dependent on the petrodollar, or is that also something that may change or may have started to change by then? Are we seeing any trend where, for example, the Chinese yuan would make a greater entry into this whole geopolitical chess board, or is the petrodollar still strong and will remain so for at least the foreseeable future?
I mean, there is a trend of de-dollarization globally that has started a few years ago with the BRICS group. That is gaining traction, I would say. But I would say when it comes to the petrodollar and the use of the dollar in especially in transaction in the oil market, I think it will really be down to a strategic decision taken by especially the likes of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iraq. And if you think of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, these countries have had defense agreements with the US, and they may be in a situation where they think that that defense agreement, it hasn't helped us that much actually in the past few weeks. So maybe they would want to go away a little bit from the dollarization of their transactions and maybe move more into using yuan from China, trying to get a more strategic and more defensive relationship with China. Obviously, these countries have a very strong economic relationship already with China, but not really on the defense side. So maybe we could start to see these trends depending on their strategy. But at the end of the day, I think that obviously it will depend on the outcome of how this war ends. But I think that the dollar is going to remain the most used currency for the foreseeable future in the world, even though that trend of de-dollarization will slowly gain traction.
Very well said, Mr. Humayun Falakshai. Thank you very much. We are all hoping that the worst case scenario does not come true. The best case option actually materializes right here where we are in Islamabad. Always a pleasure to have you on our show. After last night's segment on why it feels good to be a Pakistani, a lot of people reached out and in one way or another said the same thing. Yes, it feels good. It feels really good to see Pakistan in a positive light, to see Islamabad at the center of diplomacy, to see the world talking about Pakistan for something other than a crisis. I think many people felt that deeply. But a few people also said something else, and I think they have a point. They said, fine, but let's not get carried away. And honestly, I think that is fair. Let's not pretend we woke up in a brand new country this morning. We didn't. Our politics is still messy. The economy is still under strain. Institutions still have weaknesses. And none of this has vanished just because there may be another round of US-Iran talks in Islamabad. But I also think there's a mistake on the other side, which is to assume that acknowledging those problems means refusing to recognize when something genuinely positive is happening. These two things can coexist. We can be honest about our weaknesses and still recognize our strengths. Let's look at the facts. There were direct talks in Islamabad. There may be another round. Pakistan is still trying to bring both sides back despite uncertainty. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has been travelling across the region. Field Marshal Asim Munir has just concluded a critical and crucial trip to Tehran. International media is talking about Pakistan's role. World leaders are acknowledging it. This is not fantasy. This is actually happening. Now, does that mean Pakistan has solved this crisis? Not yet. A venue is not a peace deal. Hosting talks is not the same as resolving the issue. Talks may still stumble. But something else can also be true at the same time. Pakistan has made itself matter in this moment. And I think people feel proud of that. And they should. There's a line I used recently that I want to return to because I think it captures something important. This is not punching above our weight. This is using our weight. There's a difference. A country of 250 million people, nuclear armed, strategically located, does have weight. The question has always been whether it uses that weight effectively. And right now, I can say, at least in this moment, there are signs that we are. And maybe that is part of what people are responding to. Maybe they're not reacting simply to diplomacy. Maybe they're reacting to the idea that Pakistan can operate impactfully when it really matters. You know, for many of us, national pride often comes in short bursts. Winning a cricket match, breaking an Olympic record, thrashing a belligerent neighbor in a war, and then it fades. This feels different to me. This feels more profound because it feels good to win in a stadium or in a battlefield. Absolutely it does. But it also feels really, really good to help win peace. Now let me add something that also matters. I don't think this should be treated as just a feel-good moment. I think it may be the beginning of a more honest conversation with ourselves. Can we be realistic about our problems without becoming trapped in cynicism? Can we acknowledge weaknesses without allowing weaknesses to define our entire national self-image? Can we accept that a country can be flawed and still have strengths worth building upon? These are not abstract questions. These are practical ones. And I think this moment, right here, it allows us to ask them. The US and Iran will do what they will do. These talks may happen, they may not happen. That part we do not control. But how we understand this moment, that we do actually control. And if this moment helps Pakistanis feel a little bit more confident, a little less cynical, a little more aware of what the country can be at its best, then something valuable has already happened. Pakistan did not become perfect this week. Pakistan became visible in a different light. And sometimes that is how bigger changes begin. Not all at once, not through one summit or one round of talks, but through a moment that changes how a nation sees itself. And if even a little of that is happening, which I think it is, honestly, that is worth feeling good about.